Chris,
Yes.
we've been hearing a lot about Composable. I would love to know from your opinion, what is it and how did it come about?
Well, Zia, the way it came about is, at Netlify, we saw an opportunity for decoupling the web essentially to begin with, right? And so that meant that you would no longer have a big web monolith running everything. Instead, you would slice out the business logic, the data, the back end, and not have it dictate how you build your digital experience, your web experience layer, or your front end, essentially. And that would lead to a faster and more scalable web because you would have multiple points of origin, and they wouldn't code for every visitor. You would also separate out the build image, have that run locally, which makes it much more secure. It would also enable web developers, right? Which is very important because very often out there in enterprises, agencies, and so on, those are the developers that build these experiences, app stores and sites, but then they're handed off for implementation. And that's where deadlines and everything else goes to die. Where you send something over and whatever you get back doesn't look like it. And so it's depending on quite heavy operations. And this model for building digital experience would enable them to just pull in all that data, but from APIs. So those APIs wouldn't actually dictate how the properties themselves were built. And so that would enable them to, when they were done, they could actually push live, right? And the last thing it did was pave the way for composable architecture. And what that is really the idea that instead of having a monolith, that means one big piece of software that does everything, your content management, your commerce, whatever it might be, you're able to use best-in-class components. So you can use the right commerce component, the right content management component, the right build tool, whatever it is you want, and not use everything else. And it allows you for much faster time to market, better flexibility, so you can differentiate your brand better, more scalability, security, and so on. There's a lot of benefits attached to it. But yeah, composable architecture wasn't able to be done before because each one of those functions would have as an output a complete property, right? And you only have one .com. So you would have one monolith doing all of it. But now, because in a composable world, they can be accessible as APIs, you can then go and say, well, for whatever digital touch points, you can build out separately, pulling in data from those different components. So composable architecture is really the notion that we no longer have to be stuck with a monolith that gives us very slow time to market, that's best in class at nothing, and that is ungovernable and sluggish and frankly quite bloated by now.
I like that a lot. It feels like over the time of building for the web, there's been these best practices that we've been able to extract, right? And that composable architecture is this method of executing in a best practice in terms of building for the modern web. I'm curious, what are some of the unique challenges that Netlify can help solve in terms of these differentiated experiences and solutions that composable architecture stands to solve?
Absolutely. I mean, you said it yourself, right? It's best practices. So I see as we went from a bottom-up movement that was, as any grassroots tech movement is, very carried by developers, that had a bigger focus, as they should at that point, on technology and less so on business outcomes and use cases. And larger solutions was always self-architected. We're now moving into a place where there's not just developers, stakeholders, but also marketers, enterprise architects, and lots of others. They're not self-architecting traditionally to the same extent. SIs would often be more involved, and there are more components first. We often see that this early majority, as we're crossing the chasm, because composable architecture has, when we started, it was a couple of companies. Now it's 2,500 companies, right? And it's really taking off. And you ask Gartner, and they'll tell you that 70% of enterprises this year plans to build with composable architecture. So in other words, it's happening, and it's happening at scale. But if you just go out there and think you're done, if you choose the right components, but you don't think of this holistically, you don't change your operations, you let everything stay the same, well, then you're still not cashing in on most of the benefits of going composable in the first place. Because let's look at it, right? It's fantastic to have the right headless content management and the right headless commerce solution. But none of them will give you any digital touch point because that's not what they're rendering or building out. And so they can't really influence the speed of that, right? So if you want something that's really performant and is so by default, then you have to think about how you're building that out and how you're doing your operations around it. And very importantly, if you want that faster time to market, right? Well, and faster time to value, then you really have to think about, am I still doing operations as usual? Like, so I have composable components, but I haven't embraced composable architecture. And when it fails, and I see that as member of the board of the Market Alliance as well, it's almost always because there hasn't been a holistic implementation. It's because you're stuck with saying, well, I have all my infrastructure engineering teams, and I have my DevOps, and I have all my system administrations, all the same as before. So it's a theory of constraints. The bottleneck will still be there. They might not be there as you're catering your commerce needs in building out that functionality. But as soon as it actually has to move towards being compiled into a digital touch point, you're right back to where you started, right? You're handing something over to DevOps. You're hoping that you hear back from them in a few months, right? And that's really what Netlify changes. In a nutshell, I think it's every enterprises before coming to Netlify, I think they deploy, so make a new release every 2 or 3 weeks on average. I can't remember the exact number there, but on average, enterprise clients, and we have a lot of them by now, right? I mean, Netlify has in total more than 32 million store sites and apps made by more than 4 million businesses and developers on the platform. And on average, enterprise clients deploy almost 25 times a day.
It's amazing.
So it's completely different. And that's not just from having, a CDCI tool that's better or using the right edge nodes and so on. It's the holistic effect of really taking all of that infrastructure and all that operation and turning it into code. It's the idea of you having a central source of truth. That's why your dependencies are scoped down in a way where you can move really fast, right? Where you can publish something, you can roll it back in 1/10 of a second. You reduce your dependencies to things that are part of the same workflow, right? Rather than having these isolated islands out there that has to be coordinated. That, of course, also helps with reducing your costs. Right? You no longer need 8 different types of engineers and so on to run operations. It's there by default. And a lot of operations are also invisible to these choices normally. Let's talk security, for example, right? We have a lot of things that needs to be, it's securable, but it requires quite a bit of overhead, making sure that all your staging environments, production environments, and development environments are up to date, right? And you have upgraded every last version of Apache and PHP and SQL and whatnot, right? And by default, that's abstracted away here. So it's not just because Netlify does it for you, it's because we remove the need for having to run that, right? You push to Git, you get a deploy preview URL back, you're done, right? Yep. And so it's a very different way of thinking about this. And those efficiencies, they cannot be gotten by just choosing the right component. So I always say when I'm out speaking around this, that composable success and success with my project comes from the best-in-class components and the right way to tie it all together.
I like that a lot. That's powerful. So my next question would be, if somebody were to begin their composable journey, taking in mind the why and the how, and how Netlify sits at the center, if we were going to begin the composable journey, where would we begin that journey?
I think there's more than one answer, because it really depends on what you're trying to achieve and who's coming at this, right? Very often, a big part of those more than 100,000 new developers and businesses we get on the platform every month are developers. They might have small self-contained projects and they're just looking for something to get live incredibly fast, right? And that's it. Like you tie in your headless CMS and you build, so you click a button and you're done. If you're doing this at a little larger scale in an enterprise, let's say it's a larger commerce solution, or you're actually trying to look at how does how does adopting composable architecture as a digital strategy look like? There are more stakeholders. And I think there's two things here that's very important to understand is one, and I spent 14 years in agencies before doing Netlify, right? And we all come from a world where we build out a new monolith, we ported everything over from the old one, we feature locked, and 18 months later, we were live with something that was already undated software, right? That is not how the new world goes. And I think the most beautiful promise of the Jamstack composable architecture, Mach, right, this way of building, is that you can do gradual migration. You can take things step by step. You don't have to leave a monolith behind in order to do experimentation, in order to upgrade your checkout page, for example, right? It's not either or. So you start with where do you have the most impact, and where does it make most sense for your company to or organization to start. That's something that we helped a lot of organizations with thousands, if not tens of thousands, over the years. And another thing is that, again, we're talking at scale here, right? If you're doing a greenfield project, this is not, of course, as relevant. But I think a lot of organizations, they see it as almost a Herculean, impossible task up front, right? To get off this monolith, right? Because it has all these tentacles and it has all this legacy, and you might even have mainframes underneath that stands in the basement running something that's 20 years old. And how will we ever go to composable? And the answer is you're not. As in, you don't have to move all of it over. I think the reality for most companies today is that you're going to have multiple constant sources, right? And some of them are running in a quote unquote monolithic way, because the impact of porting that old job database over to modern architecture might not be worth it. But what Netlify can come and help you with is making it into an API, so it can be pulled in as you build with other modern architectures, right? We work a lot with getting your monolith headless, right? So you can experience faster time to first byte, right? Higher conversion rates and so on, because you have more resilient, more performant, more scalable end digital touch points. Of course, that doesn't mean that you have a necessarily much faster time to market, because you still have a monolith behind it. Yeah. But that can also be a way of getting started, right? Very often at scale, you'll also be working with SIs that can help guide you and talk about how do you think about this holistically, right? And who are all the different stakeholders? Because in the old monolithic world, where we were all building and the monolith was dictating everything, that also meant that we had very verticalized solutions, right? So whatever the business needs was from solution would also dictate everything down to the web properties and digital touch points. And that meant that our teams, our budgets, that part of the organization was very siloed as well. Now with composable architecture and using Netlify, you are now opening up for breaking down those silos. But that means a bit of change management. That means that even though you're getting a lot more for a lot less, right? Because you can think about planning your resources a lot more efficiently, it still requires some change, right? And so that's something SIS and Netlify can help with as well. So the reality is, as wonderful as it would be to say this is super clean, you just start over here and there you go. There's more ways to roam than one, right? Whether it's a small isolated greenfield project, whether you're just trying to figure out where to start, or whether you're saying, hey, we have a monolith and we want to add to it, rather than just think that we're off it in a year or two. All of those are viable. But you have to think about it holistically. Nothing is solved by just choosing a composable single component, right? That is not going to scale. And nothing is going to change your organization if it's just 3 people that were allowed to do a greenfield project and they invested some technology that's only employed for that one project. If it's not something that is set up to be adopted by other stakeholders across your organization, then you are where you are.
What would you say are some key milestones that somebody or an organization, an enterprise, large-scale business can map out in order to measure their success in their composable journey?
Absolutely. So that's a great question, right? I think you start by understanding what are the business outcomes that you're trying to get out of this, right? I think we all came from something that was about a technical revolution, So we've had a very strong focus on the technology for the sake of technology in the beginning. And then we were very sort of, and we saw that in Market Alliance as well and so on, right? More sort of, hey, it's a feature story, right? And I think we really have to, as we're also crossing the chasm, embrace that this is all about business outcomes, and technology is only relevant as far as it's an enabler, right? And so look at what it is you're trying to achieve. So that has to do often with your main challenges, right? So if you're too slow to respond to market, and that's something we hear extremely often, simply because and I just mean the collective we, right? In marketing departments and organizations around the world, we all came from on-prem, right? And then we embraced the cloud, and we did that for really two reasons, right? Scalability and multitude of services, but it was operations as usual, right? So you were still building things out yourself, right? You had a Home Depot now where you can go and buy your building blocks, right? But from your cloud provider, but you still had to sort of run things in the same way as before. And when this was happening, there were maybe 50 services that you as an enterprise needed to tie together. Now it's more than 1,000, right? You add composable architecture with best-in-class components on top of that, and it's no longer tenable, right? So you have to change the way you think about these things, right? You have to think about, how do I not enable myself to operate all of this, but how can I abstract as much of it as possible as a way, right? It's not about being better at sending varnish cash. It's about never having to do it again, right? And so I think this whole notion of automation and abstracting that away is a very powerful one. So it all comes down to that faster time to market, right? That means doing things a bit differently. And the reason we have that slow time to market is because the basic architecture of our operations, how we created digital marketing solutions, the overall frameworks for that were created in a time where there was a lot fewer digital touch points.
Yeah.
And there was a lot less complexity. And I think the reality just is that the price we're paying for that today is that there's a ton of check and balances, right? And there's a ton of stakeholders, and there's a lot of operation, and there's a lot of complexity. And that leads to us, especially in large organizations, being very, very slow to respond, right? It is not uncommon to have basic.com for an FMCG right over to be an 18-month, 24-month project, which is completely unacceptable, right? That has to change. And it changes by not optimizing and bandaging and treating symptoms on what we were doing already, but by more fundamentally going and saying, hey, there's something here that has to be replaced and abstracted away, right? Now, that doesn't stand alone. It has to coincide and work together with the legacy monolith, because that is too much to just do in an instant. But we have to start somewhere, right? And so I think measuring your milestones here, very often one of them will be, how fast can I deliver? Like, right. How fast can I make changes? And one of the most important KPIs for a lot of Netlify users is that you go from pushing something live, sometimes once a quarter, once a month, every 2 weeks. We have some that manage to do it once a week. Netlify, the average, once again, is 25 times to production a day, right? That is a huge number, and it seems impossible, but it isn't. It's a result of doing a lot of different things, right? But Netlify really sort of, again, gives you a single point of control and gives you unified release management and takes so much of that operation and many of those people dependencies and turn it into just code, right? That single source of truth, that singular workflow, that is how, even if behind the scenes it's hugely complex because you have all these different components, some composable, modern architecture, made with composable modern architecture, and some of them are legacy, but all of them can be pulled into these unified workflows with Netlify. And so that's a very big one, right? But if you want to check off your milestones, then you first have to think about, okay, what are the challenges? One of them is faster time to market. That would be a concrete way of doing it. Another will, of course, be something like conversion on your digital touch points, right? That's super relevant, right? And so that has, as we all know, very much to do with performance, right? How fast does things load? Like, look at any larger publishing survey published from Deloitte or Amazon and Google or Yahoo or whoever has done that over the years that has showed what's the value of a second, right? And it's very often more than double-digit percentage in conversion, right? And I think especially when we talk things like retail, for example, where the profits today are fairly thin, right? They're slim, and it's very much a volume game. Embracing every millisecond of reduction in time to first byte and full load time, it becomes extremely important, right? So that's also something. So if you want to talk about how do you migrate to composable architecture and how do you measure your milestones, I would say how faster are you publishing, right? Have KPIs for that. How quickly can you deploy and respond? How quick are your sites? Like how are they converting? What are the bounce rates? Like they should be going down, right? Your conversion rate should be going up. That's it. Then I would also look at what are the dependencies, right? Like sort of how many different types of engineering capabilities and operations do I actually need for this? What are the true costs involved in not just publishing this, but also maintaining it once it's live, right? Try to get a bit of a better understanding of your holistic costs, because very often you see that that's where most of the cost is involved, right? And then once you get to places where you can say, now we're stepping off monoliths, what you also see is there's a tremendous cost saving involved, and there really should be. Everyone knows that IT admins on average spend 40% of their budget on upgrades when they're using legacy stacks, right?
Yeah.
And it's a pretty terrifying thing because you're getting basically nothing in return, right? So embracing modern SaaS architecture also really helps with that, right? But again, what are the challenges for your business, and translate that into concrete KPIs that you can measure as you embrace composable architecture, and then make sure that you're doing projects where you can gradually see the results, right? So you're not saying, hey, I would say actually, if your SI or someone will propose a shift to composable architecture where you can't see the return on investment until 5 years later, you're not doing it right. Then go back to the drawing board. You should be able to see success gradually coming in much quicker, much faster.
I really love that, because one of the initial gains that you get, in fact, with conversations that we've had with large enterprises, talking about going from shipping maybe once every other week to once a week, and to watch them light up just imagining the gains that would be had just shipping once a week. And then pushing this idea that some enterprises can ship up to 25 times a day.
Yeah.
Which means that if you're looking at composable as this architectural approach of how to do business and how to innovate and how to get ROI, shipping faster, right? Getting to market faster, your performance scores go through the roof, which means more conversions, which means if you are shipping multiple times per day, you have this rapid improvement and feedback loop that you could take information in, pivot, and watch the results continuously increase.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. So
100%.
Appreciate that. One of the common questions that we hear when we're talking about Netlify and where we sit in terms of creating solutions for sites, stores, and apps is, where does it fit in the tech stack? So I'd love to know from you and your definition of what is a tech stack in terms of composable architecture, what that looks like, and where Netlify fits into that.
Yeah, I think maybe the most meaningful way of answering that is holding it up against what people are most used to, like the legacy monolith, right? Because there you didn't talk so much of tech stacks because it was all the technology rolled up in one piece of,
Very true.
of monolithic software, right? And so what your content management system is also, it might have a commerce solution, and if it's more sort of a larger digital experience platform, it'll have analytics, it'll have build tools and template engines and all kinds of stuff all rolled into one. And you want to change one of them, well, good luck. You have to change all of them, right?
That's right.
And that's what makes it sticky. And so when you go to composable architecture, you'll hear more people talking about tech stack. What it just means is that you have more than one component, right? And that sounds daunting, but the reality just means that it allows you to only buy what you need, and it allows you to choose whatever fits your needs the best, depending on what you already have solved for. Do you already have a PIM or an ERP or whatever? Do you need that as well? And it allows you to interchange things as you go along. it allows you to go for what resources do you have, and what programming languages is something using, right? And what developers do you have, and what are they used to, right? And that just gives you a lot more efficiency and flexibility regarding your workforce as well. And so in a tech stack is really what goes into that? Like, what's your commerce solution and what's your content management solution? Where Netlify really fits into that is that in the old world, that commerce solution would also have everything else in it, right? So whatever you do when you click save or publish, it also hosts it, it runs it, it does everything, right? In the new world, these components are what we call APIs. That means that they stand alone, they have the function that they have, but they're not building out that digital experience or that touch point or that store that your user will actually interact with. They're building out the backend for it, for example, right? But not the experience in itself, not not the UI, right? And so it becomes important, how do you build that? And if you try to do that manually, you suffer having to pay a very large overhead. And so that's where Netlify comes in, where it's both an automatic way of integrating all these different sources, components, your commerce components, your content management component, and so on. It also abstracts away your need to host it, because it just automatically runs this from edge nodes all over the world. So you always have a global presence by default. And there is no configuration. The architecture itself just means that it's optimized. So you don't have to think about it. It's just going to run. It's going to be called into a browser. It just works. And so Netlify is sort of the unifying element of your tech stack, right? Where you connect things, you run things, and you deploy things, and that's essentially it, right? That's a tech stack. And then it can be extremely sophisticated if you have tons of different things, right? And often all of those wouldn't be used for the same properties. That can be different, right? But a tech stack essentially is just that.
I love that. Drawing from my own experience years ago, I remember evaluating 8 or 9 different vendors for a certain project, right?
Yeah.
And you would make this list of the pros and the cons of each of these different things. And what I really like, and what I'm picturing with Netlify, is that you have each of these services available via the ecosystem that you could plug into. Mm-hmm. Each of them might have pros and cons, but you can then select each of the individual components in Composable Architecture to get the best of each world and to run it on Netlify. I love that.
Exactly, right? That is very true.
Okay, Chris, so as a summary, what does composable success look like?
Well, from a helicopter point of view, composable success equals best-in-class components plus unified release management, where everything you need to connect, build, and run your digital projects is done by Netlify.
Love it. Thank you.